Following the March on Rome in October 1922, Benito Mussolini ascended to the position of Italy's youngest prime minister at the time. He systematically eliminated political opposition using his secret police and by suppressing labor strikes, effectively attacking the Italian state. Mussolini and his supporters solidified their control by implementing various methods and laws, which ultimately turned Italy into a one-party dictatorship. In the following years, a dictatorial regime was established, creating a new totalitarian state in Europe. The Italian dictator recognized that Italy was not prepared for a prolonged conflict due to its limited resources and its smaller pre-World War II military interventions in Ethiopia, Albania, and Spain. Mussolini agreed to enter the war and continue the campaign as long as the regime's unrealistic imperial ambitions were being pursued and supported by his strongest ally. He aspired to revive a version of the ancient Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. By late 1942, these goals had been partially achieved. By that time, Italian influence spanned the Mediterranean region, and the Axis powers were at the height of their dominance on all fronts. Albania, parts of Slovenia, coastal Dalmatia, and Montenegro had been directly incorporated into the Italian state. After the Greco-Italian War and the Battle of Greece, most of Greece was occupied by Italy. On October 28th, Mussolini demanded that Greece surrender some of its territory. Before the deadline for this ultimatum passed, the Italian army launched an invasion of Greece. The Italian army's ineffectiveness was evident, making the invasion a complete disaster. 140,000 troops faced a determined enemy, with most of the fighting occurring in the mountainous terrain along the Albanian-Greek border. What was anticipated to be a swift victory turned into a failure by mid-November. The Greeks halted the Italian invasion and subsequently drove the enemy back into Albania. Eventually, the Italo-German forces secured victories against Greece and Yugoslavia. They also occupied parts of British-held Egypt, advancing to El Alamein following their triumph at Gazala. However, Italy's conquests faced significant resistance. Despite the defeats of Yugoslavia and Greece, strong partisan movements persisted in these regions, causing considerable difficulties for Axis forces. Following the struggles in North Africa, Mussolini sought assistance from his German ally. By May 1943, the Allies had defeated the Axis forces in North Africa. Even before their victory, disagreements arose among the Allies regarding future strategies. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, emphasized Britain's naval power. His strategy was to conduct targeted small-scale operations to weaken the enemy. The United States, with its larger army, favored a more direct and forceful strategy of combat. The ability to launch such a campaign depended on first securing victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. They believed that to end the war in Europe, a full-scale invasion of France needed to occur as soon as possible. The British, on the other hand, argued that having a substantial number of troops trained for amphibious landings in the Mediterranean made a limited-scale invasion feasible and more advantageous. Ultimately, the U.S. and British political leaders agreed to a compromise, deciding to allocate the majority of their forces to an invasion of France in early 1944. They also embarked on a smaller-scale campaign in Italy. Franklin D. Roosevelt was keen to keep U.S. troops engaged in the European theater in 1943, and the prospect of knocking Italy out of the war appealed to him. Aware of Italy's internal problems and previous military struggles, it was hoped that the invasion could force Italy out of the conflict. Eliminating Italy from the war would allow Allied naval forces, primarily the Royal Navy, to dominate the Mediterranean Sea and potentially establish a larger southern front. Italian divisions stationed for occupation and coastal defense in the Balkans and France would be redeployed to defend Italy. Meanwhile, the Germans would need to transfer troops from the Eastern Front to defend Italy and the entire southern coast of France, thereby providing assistance to the Soviets. A combined Allied invasion of Sicily commenced on July 10, 1943, featuring both amphibious and airborne landings. The land forces included the U.S. 7th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General George S. Patton, and the British 8th Army, led by General Bernard Montgomery. The German and Italian defenders were unable to stop the Allies from seizing the island, but they successfully evacuated the majority of their troops to the mainland. On September 3, 1943, forces from the British 8th Army, still under Montgomery, landed in the toe of Italy during Operation Baytown. This was the same day the Italian government agreed to an armistice with the Allies. The armistice was made public on September 8th through two announcements, one by General Eisenhower and the other by Marshal Badoglio. Despite the German forces being ready to defend on their own, there was hope that the Italian government's surrender would lead the Germans to retreat to the north. On October 13, 1943, 1 month after surrendering to the Allied forces, Italy declared war on Germany, its former Axis partner. Prime Minister Benito Mussolini, who had allied Italy with Germany in 1936, led the country into the war. In the summer of 1943, when Allied forces landed in Sicily, public support for both the war and Mussolini declined. Mussolini was ousted on July 25th, and his successor, General Pietro Badoglio, sought peace with the Allies, reaching an armistice on September 3rd. Germany, with troops already stationed across Italy, swiftly occupied the country and took control of strongholds from the disorganized Italian military. Given that only a small portion of Italy was occupied, why did they switch sides so readily? Despite Italy's potential to become a great power, it had many deficiencies, extending beyond the military sphere. With a fragmented society after the First World War, the political landscape was marred by instability, ultimately leading to the rise of a leader who promoted war and fanaticism. Italian logistical deficiencies were evident in their campaigns, primarily due to the lack of proper equipment, which stemmed from various factors. The army was not only poorly equipped with outdated or insufficient weapons, but also, in some cases, inadequately trained. Many army officers prepared the troops for traditional combat scenarios, failing to adapt to the new type of warfare. Additionally, some generals were selected more for their loyalty than their competence. Although Italy was considered Germany's main ally, the country was not prepared for a large-scale conflict. Their industrial sector was modest, and the soldiers' preparedness and training were inadequate. Large-scale industries were essential for such military campaigns. Germany prioritized the development and production of industries for tanks, artillery, warplanes, and other military equipment. In contrast, the Italian army was poorly equipped to engage in a war against Great Britain or the United States. Italian industries were outproduced both in quantity and quality compared to those of its enemies. The geographical perspective made the situation even worse. As a large peninsula with extensive coastlines to defend, Italy faced significant challenges. An enemy capable of conducting amphibious and paratrooper landings in seas, increasingly controlled by enemy ships, signaled poor prospects for continuing the war. The Navy effectively secured the coasts and large areas of the sea during the war. However, the significant drawback was the lack of sufficient and technologically advanced warplanes to support naval operations. North Africa might have acted as a buffer between continental Italy and the Allies, but the failed campaign there led to British and American landings in Sicily and subsequently in the toe of Italy. To much of the political class, it was evident that Italian forces were facing a more powerful enemy. The war had shifted from being fought outside their borders to within. As the Allies advanced, they encountered increasingly difficult terrain. Allied forces moved slowly north through the Italian peninsula, eventually defeating Axis forces in May 1945. Mussolini, after being rescued by the Germans from an Italian prison and appointed leader of the puppet Italian Social Republic in areas not occupied by the Allies, was captured and executed by members of the Italian partisan resistance.